So suivant, we have Elizabeth Whelan-McGregor, who comes to us from Anna Maria College, where she teaches in the Humanities and History departments. Elizabeth got her PhD from SUNY Stony Brook and is working on a monograph called Hot Encounters, Jazz and Post-War French Identity, which has a fabulous title, and has presented, in fact, on a similar topic last year at the French Historical Studies meeting in Cambridge. The French Jazz Public and Cold War Cultural Diplomacy was the title of that paper. And then one of her more notable recent articles, in fact it's a chapter in an edited collection, and again I love the title here, Jammin' on the Champs-Élysées, Jazz, France in the 1950s, which was published in Here, There and Everywhere, The Foreign Politics of American Popular Culture. Elizabeth is going to talk to us today about jazz, the Algerian War and Decolonization, which is, I think, a most fascinating line of inquiry. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. During the Algerian War, the Arab and Berber populations in Algeria would find it easy to equate jazz with French colonial rule, not with the music connected intrinsically to African or African-American culture. At this time, the most active participants in the Algerian jazz public were French settlers and soldiers, not members of the indigenous population. Although Arab and Berbers outnumbered Europeans in Algeria by 8 to 1, French jazz enthusiasts in North Africa rarely alluded to their existence. Even as jazz critics and fans back in France often labeled themselves anti-racists in this period, they did not tend to question the goal of keeping Algeria an intrinsic part of France, and offered no outright support for Algerian nationals. Politics rarely entered into French discussions about jazz in Algeria during the war. Members of the French jazz community did not differentiate themselves from the mainstream French public in this regard, as they refrained from criticizing the French effort to hold on to Algeria. The jazz musicians Marshall Solal and Errol Parker were both born in Algeria in the 1920s, and their lives signaled the importance of American and French jazz for settlers in Algeria who became enamored with the music. Additionally, Solal and Parker's sense of national belonging reflected the blurred lines between claimed French and Algerian identities. The pianist Solal was born in Algiers in 1927, and like so many of his contemporaries, first heard jazz as an adolescent on the radio. After he became a professional musician at the age of 18, he performed at a colonial hotel in Algiers, as well as on Radio Alger. During his military service as a young man, he was stationed in Rabat and played the piano and the clarinet on Radio Maroc. In 1950, he left North Africa for Paris, where he continued pursuing his musical career away from his birthplace. The jazz pianist and drummer Errol Parker was born with the name Raphael Chakroun to a Jewish family in Oran in 1925. When he was 14, he lived next to a movie theater that played the same Django Reinhardt jazz record during intermissions every day. He also heard jazz through the radio, records, and friends, and by his late teens became a jazz pianist. He served in the French Army during World War II before moving to France. In 1960, he Americanized his name by changing it to Errol Parker, Errol for the jazz pianist Errol Garner, and Parker for the saxophonist Charlie Parker. He never returned to Algeria to live, but remained in Paris until 1967, when he permanently relocated to New York. In his autobiography, Parker identified himself as Algerian and emphasized his links to Africa, not to France, saying, quote, "I come from a simple, acoustic African tradition of just wood, skin, and metal," end quote. Obviously, Solal and Parker's own identities were complicated by lives lived in Algeria, France, and other places, and they could easily identify with multiple homelands. But without exception, they were pegged by the French jazz community as being valid members of the dominant French culture, even when they wanted to bring a North African approach to their music or understood themselves to be Algerian. Their experiences were exceptional because of their eventual celebrity in France. But they both had an organic connection to the settler community and became jazz and became jazz fans while they were adolescents living in Algiers and Oran, the most populous and Europeanized of colonial Algerian cities. Members of the settler community were a central component of the jazz public before and during the Algerian War. They went to COBs, attended concerts, joined jazz clubs, listened to radio programs, and bought available records. And Salon and Parker were part of this community before the war. French soldiers played a visible and vocal role on the wartime Algerian jazz scene, at times even eclipsing the settler fans in terms of notoriety and influence. By the late 1950s, France had 600,000 troops in Algeria, and the vast majority of them were conscripts. By the end of the war, an estimated 2.5 million French servicemen had spent time in Algeria, many of them harboring resentment against the very same settler population they were obliged to protect, so that there was not always easy camaraderie or mutual understanding among members of the jazz public in Algeria. For many jazz fans serving in the military, there was a sense of estrangement from France and from their preferred cultural pursuits. Certainly, the jazz offerings in North Africa did not compare to those back in France. In 1959, a young soldier wrote into the French periodical Jazz Magazine to say, quote, "I would like to establish communication between isolated fans like me," end quote. He indicated there were others like him living in the country's villages and mountains. These fans were in Oran, Algiers, Constantine, and territories in the south, and the soldier claimed, quote, "Jazz would be a way for us to keep up morale," end quote. In the summer of 1960, an officer serving in North Africa wrote to say that, quote, "The radio is the simplest and easiest way to reach the largest number of people in the military," end quote. Because this officer was stationed in the Algerian city of Colombey-Char, he could listen to a military radio station during his free time at night. So each week he tuned into the program Béchar Jazz. He regretted the fact that he and his cohort had only a small number of jazz records and maintained, quote, that Radiodiffusion Télévision Française has promised us records, but we have received nothing. You see our extreme destitution. It is too bad because the audience for Radio Béchar is essentially military and jazz programs especially interest us," end quote. In response to this letter and the claim that members of the military stationed in North Africa wanted to hear more jazz, Jazz Magazine called on its readers to send LPs or 78s in good condition to be used in on the Béchar Jazz program. And not only were soldiers important and maybe even ideal audience members for radio broadcasts and concerts, but they were musicians as well. And compared with settlers, these soldiers had had more recent exposure to the jazz happenings in France, which they then brought with them to Algeria. In 1962, a soldier, Jean Christie, worked as a reporter for Jazz Magazine and turned in a story about 3 of his fellow combatants who were also jazz musicians. When their military service ended, these men remained in Algiers to play jazz. And for Christie, this filled a void for his fellow soldiers who craved to hear more of the music. He wrote, quote, "In Algiers, in uniform and material and psychological conditions that one can only imagine, many conscripts do not forget that they must have jazz," end of quote. In the summer of 1962, a month before Algeria officially became an independent nation, this young Frenchman still seemed to hope for a return to some semblance of the colonial status quo, and assumed that jazz and the French listeners who supported the music in North Africa would remain after the war. He stated that in this city, jazz, quote, "is part of these distractions that one hopes to find later with the return of normal life under the hot African sun," end quote. Christie noted that jazz enthusiasts in Algiers were resourceful, quote, "knowing to use with an ingenuity that never falters the smallest local resources, here a cov, there an old piano that someone fixed up. These fans have formed little by little ensembles that are extremely dynamic and likable and that breed the spirit of pioneers," end quote. Christie titled his article, "A Hard Apprenticeship," to indicate the difficult realities facing the French jazz community in Algeria. Quote, cut off from a large public, these amateur musicians play above all for themselves, for the love of a music that brings them one of their only true joys, end quote. He mentioned neither the Arabs nor the Berbers, who made up the majority of the country's population, who had been engaged in a violent war for independence since 1954, and who clearly imagined a different future for their nation. For the French jazz public, these Algerian nationals went unnoticed, while French settlers and soldiers sustained the jazz culture in Algeria. Like much regarding the colonial mission, the viewpoints, desires, and talents of the Europeans remained privileged, while those of the colonized were ignored and rarely discussed. Other French citizens living in Algeria also participated in sustaining jazz's place there. One such individual, Claude Zeppeli, wrote a letter to Jazz magazine to tell readers about his unusual experience. A Frenchman from the mainland, he had gone to live in Algeria near the Sahara Desert because of his professional work in geophysics. Because he was already a jazz fan when he arrived, he felt compelled to find a way to remain connected to the music during his time away from France, from the metropole. After spending several months in the city of Touggourt, he founded a weekly jazz program. He was thrilled by this achievement and proudly proclaimed jazz in the heart of the Sahara. Two nearby towns provided additional opportunities to join up with other jazz aficionados, and the large number of soldiers who completed their service in the region contributed to the jazz public both as listeners and as musicians. Zeppeli declared that his radio program was a frank success and asserted that numerous listeners had written to ask for their favorite records. He produced his show with the 50 records he owned, which included those of Miles Davis, Duke Ellington, and the Jazz Messengers. He ended his letter by saying that he looked forward to returning to Paris, quote, because it is there that things are the best, end quote. Zeppeli's correspondence from Algeria is thought-provoking for a number of reasons. It not only showed a French jazz fan with no prior professional experience in the music industry founding a jazz radio show in a Saharan town, but it also illustrated the idealized centrality of African-American musicians in the French jazz fan's mind. Because all of the artists he directly mentioned were not only from the United States, but were black as well. Back in France, supporters of jazz publicly actively supported the American Civil Rights Movement, and influential critics declared themselves anti-racists, activities that would have logically been antithetical to supporting French colonial power. That supporters of jazz participated in bolstering the image of a strong French Algeria illustrates the complexity of cultural usage. These men harnessed the popularity of jazz, a music whose origins had more in common with the colonized than the colonizers, to shore up French morale and culture, and to deny the obvious circumstances of politics and war. Despite this adulation of African-American musicians, which members of the French jazz community bought into, whether they were in France or in places like Algeria, Paris remained the best cultural locale for men like Zeppeli, not New York or Chicago or New Orleans, and certainly not Algiers or Oran or Constantine. In a familiar move by French jazz fans, African-American musicians were lauded in a way that illustrated a particularly French way of appreciating the black genius. French critics and fans studied, discussed, and broadcast their understandings of jazz and of the artists who created it from the privileged center of the metropole, from Paris. And no member of the French jazz community noted the philosophical inconsistency of admiring one subaltern culture and people, jazz and African Americans, while subjugating other ones through colonial domination and war. In 1960, a number of well-known professional French musicians participated in the Salon du Jazz in Oran, along with American artists. Mez Mesro, Jack Butler, Kansas Fields were some participants from the United States. A writer for the periodical The Bulletin du Hot Club de France who covered the event, claimed that this was, quote, the first event of this kind in North Africa, end quote. For him, the numerous amateur musicians from Algiers and Oran who participated in the shows proved the, quote, strong potential and an excellent spirit, end quote, among jazz enthusiasts in Algeria. And he hoped that, quote, this first festival, which serves as a witness to the good health of jazz in Algeria, will serve as a model for other events to come. Again, this is 1960. I think this quote is fascinating that he says that this festival is a witness to the good health of jazz in Algeria. Besides noting that the organizer of the event had proven his courage in putting the festival together, the writer seemed oblivious to the turmoil engulfing the North African country and the tensions surrounding the rule of de Gaulle's new Fifth Republic. For him, bearing witness to the health of jazz in Algeria was akin to confirming the potency of French rule there. By this time, Oran was the only Algerian city that retained a European majority, and its inhabitants were constantly faced with the threat of violence that accompanied this war. Those who attended the Salon de Jazz in Oran were European residents whose presence augmented France's cultural and military vigor and denied the successes and claims of the FLN, whose leaders were using any means at their disposal, including bombings and attacks on civilian populations, to rid Algeria of the French. In 1959, de Gaulle himself had used the word self-determination when speaking of Algeria's future, and in 1960 further alienated settlers by referring to an emancipated Algeria, an Algerian Algeria, an Algerian Republic. By the time the Salon du Jazz took place, a variety of indicators convincingly pointed to a changing reality, while the organizers of the event refused to see anything but the well-being of jazz and, by implication, the French colonial mission. In 1961, the settler paramilitary group, the OAS, embarked on a campaign of violence against French officials and citizens accused of going along with French governmental negotiations to end the war. Supporters clung to the idea of a French Algeria and would unsuccessfully attempt to assassinate de Gaulle on September 8, 1961. While members of both the FLN and the OAS planned and carried out escalating numbers of terrorist attacks, concert organizers held a Festival d'Alger that reunited 60 jazz musicians, all of them quote-unquote Algerian. The musicians who participated in the Festival d'Alger, Christie Gorin, Jean-Christophe Michel, Jacques Saigny, Pierre Siste, and Olivier Despax, were themselves settlers who claimed Algerian identity as their own. A correspondent for the French periodical Jazz Hot wrote that Saigny had represented Algeria at a French jazz festival in 1960. This writer also labeled Despax one of the best French guitarists, complicating the difference between being Algerian and French and giving voice to the colonial notion that the two identities were not irreconcilable, but that they were in harmony with one another. The organizer of the festival had been leading his jazz orchestra in Algiers for a year, and the musicians who belonged to his band included the best Algerian musicians, as well as Frenchmen passing through the country. Just like in the 1960 Salon du Jazz, no musicians of Arab or Berber descent headlined the Festival d'Alger. As both of these festivals made clear, national affiliations became murky signifiers in the hands of French jazz devotees in North Africa. While the French jazz public overlooked Arabs and Berbers, they used the label Algerian for musicians born in Algeria who were of European origin. As a result, a jazzman français did not have to be born in the metropole to be considered French. But people rarely use this term to mean a non-white, non-European individual. White Christians, and sometimes a Jewish musician like Parker, monopolized membership to the category jazzman français and also claimed the title jazzman algérien for themselves when they had either lived or been born in Algeria. This at a time when the word Algerian held potent political meaning and signified widely different ideas of belonging for the settlers, different partisan factions within the metropole, and Algerian nationals. The settlers maintained that they were Algerian, but their affiliation with their birthplace depended on French rule. Without French authorities protecting their dominant societal position and property, the Arab and Berber populations greatly outnumbered them. How am I doing on time?
You've got a minute and a half.
All right, I think I can do it. By the 1960s, different political groups within France supported a range of ideas regarding this nation in North Africa. These ideas extended from keeping Algeria French at all costs to endorsing Algerian independence. With the exception of a small minority, Algerian nationals embraced an Algerian identity that excluded Europeans altogether. When French Algeria disappeared in 1962 and around some 650,000 people of European descent left Algeria for France, Algeria lost its conventional audience for jazz. The Evian agreements took away the ability of the Europeans in Algeria to claim allegiance to both France and Algeria. The agreement stipulated that after a transition period of 3 years, French citizens had to choose between Algerian and French citizenship. If they remained French nationals, they became foreigners in Algeria. After independence, dual nationality was not an option. In theory, settlers could have become Algerians, but because of the reality of violence, famously represented by the ultimatum, the suitcase or the coffin, Europeans could not remain in Algeria after official independence in July of 1962. In the newly sovereign Algeria, jazz had to mean something new, as it would no longer be defined and sustained by the European colonial population. For Algerians after 1962, appreciating jazz involved overcoming the false equation between it and European culture and dominance, and seeing jazz for the first time as the music originally of another oppressed and exploited people who also had ethnic and cultural ties to Africa. Thanks.